How the economy machine works in 30 minutes. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it or they don't agree on how it works, and this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economy template. Though it's conventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep for global financial crisis, and it has worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create forces that drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. And number three, the long-term debt cycle. Well, look at these three forces and how linking them on top of each other create a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money, so adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you could know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price, and that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economy machine. All cycle and all process and economy are driven by transactions. So if we can understand the transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its market. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the market. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its market. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, you have everything you need to know to understand the economy. Total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets. You have everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyers and sellers is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from the other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money. For these reasons, as we see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns. And every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he is more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt give him the ability to repay. In the event he can't repay, he has valuable asset to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes the lender comfortable lending him money. So increases income allows increases borrowing, which allows increases spending. And since one person is spending on another person's income, this leads to more increases borrow, and so on. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth, and is why we have a cycle. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something, and how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn and not accumulate knowledge raises our living standards. We call this productivity growth. Those who invest and hard work raise their productivity and their living standard faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that is necessarily true of the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth does fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. That is because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it. Allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it. And it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to repay the back. Allows consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. That swings occur into big cycles. One takes about 5 years, when the other takes about 700 years. While most people fear swings, they typically don't see them a cycle because they see them too up close day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we are going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experience. As mentioned, the swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increases productivity is the only way for growth. since my spending is another person's income. The economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progress like the productivity grow, right? But because we borrow, we have cycle. This is due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. You created cycle. You created a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you created a cycle. This is as true for individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy your beer credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and the liability disappear. The debt goes away and the transaction is settled. The reality is that that asset and liability disappear, that debt goes away and transaction settle. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. Total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Credit has more spending and allows income to rise past the productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes a cycle. Productivity of short run, but not over the long run. Now don't get me wrong. Credit is necessarily something bad that just causes a cycle. Credit is necessarily wrong. Economy is credit is more spending and allows incomes to rise past the productivity of the short run, but not over the long run. Now don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes a cycle. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back to them. For example, if you borrow money to buy big TV, it doesn't generate income for you to pay back to them. Borrow money generating to pay back debt. But if you borrow money to buy your tractor, and the tractor lets you harvest more crops and more money, and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit grow. Credit grow. Let me give you an example. Suppose you are on $100,000 a year and have no debt. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are credit worthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so he can spend $121,000, even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income. His spending is another person's income. His spending is another person's income. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. This leads into the short-term debt cycle. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion. The first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise, except because increases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instead out of thin air. Rise. This happens because increases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instant out of thin air. Increases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instant out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank does too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debt rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and higher repayments, they have less money over the and have less money and have higher debt repayments. They have less money left over to spend. So spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With lower interest rates, debt payments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And you see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycles, spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily, borrowers to provide and receive credit. willingness and lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there is an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth in the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people proceeded. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debts rise faster than incomes, created a long-term debt cycle. Despite people becoming more indebted, lenders even more poorly extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset values are going up. The stock market lowers. It's a boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets with borrowed money. When people do a lot of that, we call it a bubble. So even though debt assets with borrowed money. So even though debts have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly as fast to offset them. Let's call the ratio of debt to income the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset value is lower. People borrow huge amounts of money to buy assets and investments, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy, so even with the accumulation of wealth, of their rising incomes and asset values help borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever, and it doesn't. Over decades, debt burden slowly increased, creating large debt repayments. At some points, the repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further. And the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason. It happened in Japan in 1998. This is a long-term debt to peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason. For the United States and Europe and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason. It happened in Japan in 1989, and in the United States back in 1929. Now the economy begins deleveraging. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall. Credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer creditworthy, credit drives up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt payments. Scrambling to fear this whole borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As the prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can drop. This makes the borrower even less creditworthy. People feel poor, and the credit rapidly disappears. Less spending. People feel poor. Credit rapidly disappear. Poor. Credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can be lowered to save the debt. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. In the deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are low. Because interest rates are low already. But lowering interest rates doesn't work. Already low. Interest rates are low. Interest rates are already low. Interest rates are already low. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So the stimulation ends. Soon, because interest rates are already low. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrower debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can be relieved by lowering interest rates. Simply gotten too big and can be relieved by lowering interest rates. Too big and can be. Deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can be relieved by lowering interest. Burdens simply gotten too big and can be relieved by lowering interest. By lowering, too big and can be relieved by lowering interest. Can be big and can be relieved. Have simply gotten too big and can be relieved. That. By lowering interest rates. Too big and can be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realized Lenders realize that debts have become too wise to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay, and their collateral has lost value. The fear collateral has lost value. They feel crippled. They feel crippled. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual. So what do you do about the leveraging? The problem is that burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. 1. People, businesses, and governments cut their spending. 2. Debts are reduced. 2. Debts are reduced through Debts are reduced to the force and restructuring. Debts are reduced to the force. Debts are reduced to the force. Reduced the force. Debts are reduced to the force. Reduced to the force and restructuring. Debts are reduced to the force. Debts are reduced to the force. Debts are reduced to the force. Debts are reduced to the force and restructuring. 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 2. Debts are reduced to the force and restructuring. People, businesses, and governments cut their spending and restructuring. Debts are reduced to the force and restructuring.